Jerry Teplitz since 1987 and met him right here in this room. And Jerry, as many of you know, was a stepfather to my children for a long time. And I just want to say, before I get into his credentials, he is about the kindest, one of the most kind people I've ever met. And he went a long way towards making my sons what they are today because of his influence on them. So let me give you his biography. Jerry's an attorney. He graduated from Northwestern University, right, as an attorney. Well, he didn't practice very long. He practiced for about a year. And then he got into speaking. And I remember you started speaking in colleges and universities all those years ago. And then he got a doctorate in holistic health sciences, and he is now celebrating his 41st year as a professional speaker. He actually belongs to the National Speaker Association. Over the years, he's spoken to 1,800 groups and organizations, and he's spoken to over 1 million people. He is, as I said, a professional speaker. He's earned the title Certified Speaking Professional from the National Speakers Association. He's also the author of 2 bestseller books on Amazon, Switched on Selling and Switched on Networking. And he's written other books, such as Managing Your Stress in Difficult Times, Succeeding in Times of Change, and also Brain Gym for Business. He also has a weekly internet radio talk show called Healthy Alternatives. Join me in giving Jerry a warm fellowship welcome.
So, my topic is a strange beginning to a spiritual journey. I was raised Jewish, and it was an ethnic Jew. It meant I had to go to Hebrew school, which I severely hated. Got to my bar mitzvah, and that was the end of me in terms of being Jewish from a religious standpoint. No notion of spirituality involved in that at all. My spiritual journey began with the Vietnam War. And I decided, I've never talked about this topic in public. And I decided a couple of months ago to talk about it, and then I realized with the media that this was the 50th anniversary of when the Vietnam War began. And so, for me, I think it's kind of appropriate that my willingness to share at this point this kind of a journey. So, back in '66, and by the way, I do want to apologize for any military folks here because this is my journey, and it was that was a time when there was tremendous upset in the country and divisiveness and all kinds of stuff going on. So my journey began in '66. I was a junior in college, living in Brooklyn, New York, and my mom had her ear to the ground and heard that a reserve unit that was by us, who had been closed for people to sign up to become a Army reservist, had opened up the list. And she quite literally made me go to put my name on that list. So I finally said, okay, I'll go just to kind of shut you up. So I went and put my name on the list. Vietnam started building even more and more, and I had a deferment because I was in college. I wound up getting accepted to law school in '68, and deferments went away then. And so I'm in law school in Chicago, and I receive, maybe a month into being in school, or less than that, my mom calls me and says, you just got a notice to report for your draft physical. Back then, you could enlist, or you can be drafted, basically, or you go in the reserves. And so I got the notice for a draft physical in a couple of weeks. The same time, I got a notice for my Army Reserve physical for that unit I signed up 2 years before to potentially get into. So this is a story really of coincidences, quote unquote. It's events that happened, things that happened to me in this Army journey. So the first physical I did was the draft, the reserve physical. I made sure to pass that. I mean, I had nothing wrong at all. But then I had the reserve physical. Now, I had always had real difficulties with my back. It would go out on me, and I even had an x-ray from when I was younger where 2 bones had never fused in my spine. And so I was going to be raising that as a part of, why I should not be accepted in the Army. But my back hadn't gone out in a little while, so I had to be there like at 7 a.m. or something real early in the morning. So I got my roommate up in the morning in the dorm, and so I stood against the front door of our room. He was on the other side, and do you ever have somebody play football with your back? I mean, he was charging into my back because I was trying to get it to throw out. God damn it didn't work. So I got a cab to take me down to for the physical, and I'm in the back of the cab, and I'm going like this, twisting all. The guy's watching me from the rear mirror. What the hell is this guy doing? I'm trying to throw my back out, and couldn't do it. So I go through the physical, and I pass. So I have now passed 2 physicals, Army Reserves or regular Army. Army Reserves or regular Army. I picked the Army Reserves. And so I had to, the way the Army Reserves works is you have, once a month, you have 2 weeks of training and then 2 weeks of summer camp. And so I was living in Chicago. This unit was in a place called Fort Tilden in the Rockaways, right across from Brooklyn. And so I had to fly in once a month. Back then, the airlines had this thing called Youth Fare Standby. It was a half fare that you just had to wait. This is when there were lots of planes and lots of seats, and I never had a problem going in. Now, we were told that we would be called up for active duty within 90 days. And so we had no training. We had no uniforms even. So we'd show up for formation, and you get your uniforms when you go to basic training. So we had nothing. So you're in your street clothes and your warm coat because it's cold. It's starting to move into winter. And so they would stick us in an auditorium. And we'd sit there all day long. Couldn't talk to anybody, couldn't read. You just sat there. So one day, I get picked to do this errand and to go over to headquarters, and they said, you got to get us somebody to read this and sign it and bring it back. So I go over there, and I'm there for hours. And I'm going, oh shoot, they're going to be really ticked at me, like they're thinking I, am playing a game, but nothing's happened. I'm just sitting there. So I finally get the paper signed. On the way back, I decide there are a bunch of barracks that are pretty much abandoned. They're not in use, and I decided to go to the bathroom, or the latrine as it's called back then. And there are 2 other soldiers in there. And these are guys who are in uniform, they've been there. And they tell me kind of like, you're just a warm body here. They don't care. It's not a person, it's just a warm body filling a space, basically. And so I heard what they were saying, but then I went back, and instead of being upset at me for having been gone all those hours, they just said, thanks, go sit down. And so I started to realize that you are just a warm body. And so I developed an attitude, which wasn't the best attitude. It was one of, but it served me then, it was, pardon the French, of screw the army. It's called, I wanted to get out of whatever I could get out, make it as easy as I could for me to have happen. So that began the notion of this. Now, I was commuting once a month, like I was saying, to New York, and it was starting to get expensive. You know, I'm kind of a poor, starving law student, didn't have a lot of money, and so I was running up a bill. And so normally you can transfer to another unit if you finish basic training. Before basic training, you're not allowed to transfer, except for one exception that I found out. That's if another unit accepts you. Turns out, another coincidence, I had in my dormitory at school a guy who was in a military affairs unit, it's civil affairs, it's military government unit in Chicago. And it's a unit that was full of people, literally, who are PhDs and MAs and a highly degreed group of folks, and many of them were clerk typists. So he asks his commander or people in the unit if they would allow me to transfer in, and they saw I was a law student and stuff, so they said okay. So I go to my unit, and it's around March now, and I give them the paperwork, and I ask the sergeant there, when should I report to the new unit? And he said, they'll let you know. By the way, everything was gruff voice in the military. They'll let you know. You know, don't bother me. So the law school policy was you must complete your full first year of law school. If you got drafted or went into the reserves before you took final exams at the end of the first year of law school, you got 0 credit for the entire year. You'd have to repeat the entire year again. So keep that in mind as I share this part with you. So final exams are sometime like the end of May in law school. Beginning of May, I get this notice. My mom calls me and says, you just got your notice from the New York unit to report for active duty. Not 4 months of active duty, but 5 months, because it was a signal battalion I was in, and they had to do an extra month of training for whatever I was going to be doing. So that meant I would have missed taking final exams. It also meant 5 months meant I wouldn't get back in time to go through the first year again. So basically, it would have been 2 to 3 years before I was able to get back into law school to start my first year again. Well, because I had been accepted by the other unit in Chicago and I turned my paperwork in, I called the New York unit and they canceled my order. Interesting coincidence. So, my unit in Chicago, which I have not reported to yet, is going on summer camp that summer. They're going to be out in the boonies. I don't really want to go do that. So I decide, the guy said to me, the sergeant, report when they let you know. So I said, okay, I'll just go back there when I'm in September, after summer camp when I go back to law school. So I walk in to fly into Chicago, get back in there, and so the next day I go to the unit. It's a weekday. There aren't very many folks in there, and this guy's sitting at a typewriter typing, and I say, Private Teplitz reporting, and he looks at me, he looks at what he's typing, he looks at me, he looks at what he's typing and says, I don't believe it. I'm typing your orders for having missed a summer camp for 2 years of active duty for having missed summer camp. Interesting coincidence, I walked in right when that was being typed. I'm saying interesting coincidence because in the end you'll realize when you put all this together, there was no coincidence. So the duty officer comes in and says, "Where the hell were you?" and all that stuff. And I say, "Well, I was told by the sergeant not to report until I heard you, and I didn't hear anything. So here I am." So he says, "Well, we sent you a registered certified letter." So he goes and flips through the book where they recorded it. And he says, "It never came back. I never got it. The post office lost it." So he calls the commanding officer up. And the commanding officer is ragging my buns on the phone, "Terrible soldier," and stuff like that. And I'm going, "Yes, sir, no, sir, sorry, sir, didn't know, sir." And then he says, "I ought to send you on 2 years active duty." Ought to was the key. I knew he wasn't. And he didn't. So, I just started law school for my second year. And second year, you can, if you got to go into the reserves or whatever, you come back and you start the next semester. So it's now, and this happened with me going to the reserves like a few days ahead before the start of law school. So I go to law school, end of the first day, my mom calls me up and says, "We just got you notice for you to report to active duty for 4 months in Fort Knox, Kentucky for the new unit." That meant, so I didn't bother going to law school the next day. It's called, what the heck. Turns out the professor in the class that day, he uses a seating chart and kind of calls people blind, so he called on me, and I wasn't there though. The question he was going to ask me is, "Where's the courts?" Thank God I had to go for active duty because I didn't know where the courts were in Chicago yet. Anyway, so 4 months active duty means I get back out of the 4 months right a few days after the start of the next semester. So that meant now all I was going to miss was 1 semester of law school. Interesting coincidence. So, Fort Knox, Kentucky. I discovered it has a reputation as being a very easy post. There are places in the country where you run the mile every day, you do calisthenics every day, it's like you're out in the heat all day long. If it's in Louisiana, you got bugs all over. It's known as an easy post. I find out from my uncle that uncle by marriage, he's got relatives in Louisville. So I call him up and introduce myself to them, and Eugene Comer and his family, and they pick me up at the airport, and they drive me out there, and they said, when you get, weekend passage, stay at our house, and, things like that. So it's really a very open, loving, warm family that was there. So, in basic training, we are told we are confined to the barracks for the first 4 weeks. You can't leave the company area. So as I mentioned, I'm Jewish. Not practicing Jew, but I'm Jewish. I discover Friday nights they have a Jewish service, which means you can get out of the company area because you're going to Jewish service. So I went there a couple of times, but then I also found out on Sundays the Army provided buses to take all the Jewish personnel who wanted to go into Louisville to the community center in Louisville, the Jewish Community Center, where when we walked in, We had a buffet, a Jewish buffet of eggs and lox and bagels and salmon and blintzes and all of that. And you got to spend the day in the community center. You could play sports, you could read, you could swim. It's, it's a full community center. Well, I didn't even do much of that besides eating the breakfast because my cousins would come pick me up. And I'd spend the day at their house, have lunch with them. And after a week or so, they actually started fixing me up with blind dates. So here are all the other guys in the unit, in the company, stuck in the barracks. And I'm going on dates. So I was still attempting to get out of the Army during this whole thing, even though I'm in the Army, because, my back for real was a bad back, so I decided, and I also came in with got a urinary tract infection that needed treatment. One of the first mornings, the first sergeant, we're in formation, it's pretty dark out, and this guy, from West Virginia or someplace like that's going, if you get sick, you go on sick call. So he's really affirming it's okay to go on sick call. Because there are other places, other posts where in your basic training, they don't want you, if you die before you go on sick call, kind of thing. So this place was the opposite. So I decided to go on sick call about my back and urinary tract infection. So you walk over to this infirmary, you see a medic first, and you tell him what's wrong, what you got, and so he then signs to send me over to the hospital, the base hospital, which I walk over to get x-rays. So I go into the hospital, and I'm there literally for hours, waiting. It's kind of like our medical system now, where you go to a doctor and you wait for an hour kind of thing. Well, that was hours worth of waiting. And again, I'm getting nervous, what's my unit going to say? Am I goofing off? And so I finally finish the x-rays, and I get the meds for the urinary tract infection, and I go back to the infirmary, and they sign me out, go back to the unit, thinking they're going to blast me, and I give them the paperwork, and they say, okay, go back to your barracks, wait until the rest of the unit comes back from what they're doing, and then you go to lunch. You're just a warm body. So I decided there are things about basic training I didn't really want to do, like run the mile, like calisthenics. I like to exercise, but I like to do it my way, not their way. And so on mornings, and we only ran the mile 4 times in 8 weeks in this unit, versus, like I'm telling you, some of the other posts would be every single day. Plus, we had, maybe we did calisthenics a dozen times. So every time there was stuff that was going to happen I didn't want to do, in the morning they would say, step forward if you're going on sick call. 2 and 3 times a week, I stepped forward. I discovered how to game the system. So I'd go to the infirmary, and let's say I needed a refill on the urinary tract infection, or I had some real shin split problems that I needed to have a look at, or feeling a cold coming on. So you go to the medic, and he, if it was cold, he'd write a script. You're supposed to go to the infirmary, the pharmacy, get it filled, and go back to your unit. Well, I get the script. Your number, your body. So I walk out the door, go to the hospital. Discovered from the first time I went there, they had this nice cafeteria there. So I'd go and I'd have sweet roll and coffee. I ate sweet rolls back then. And I'd go into a lounge and I'd read a book that I had with me for an hour, take a nap. Maybe 4 hours later, I'd head back to the infirmary, and there were still some folks online or in there doing stuff, and go to the pharmacy, get my script, and go back to the unit. So I was doing that 3-4 times a week. Towards the end of basic training, I came back to the unit once, and the captain of the company is in there, and he says, "You go on sick call a lot, don't you?" And I go, "Yeah, I had to go get a prescription refilled." Okay. Now, in the Army, you have guard duty can come up for you, and guard duty came up for me. Guard duty is where you are on duty for 1 hour and then you're off duty for like 2 or 3 hours. Over the course of the night, you might do 3 rounds of being up. And so there are questions you have to know about being a guard, like what are the words you say if you challenge somebody and those kinds of things. So they line us up in a line, and this lieutenant's going down the line asking us the different questions from those things we're supposed to know. He gets to me, I answer the question, and then he says to me, "You're supernumerary uno." I had no idea what that was. So afterwards I go to him and say, "Excuse me, Lieutenant, what's a supernumerary uno?" And he says to me, "Boy, that means you go on guard duty only when somebody dies or gets sick. Otherwise, you're sleeping through the night." So there were 2 supernumerary unos. First shift of guard duty, somebody got sick. They woke him up. I got to sleep the entire night. Next morning, go back to the unit, and when you're on guard duty and you're done with it, you don't get like time off, you're just back in the regular stuff. So I get called to my the command post, and I'm told I'm going to be runner that night. Runner means you stay up all night. And so here I, quote unquote, had guard duty, and I just said I had guard duty. He said, "Well, too bad." Then I remembered when I went into basic training, they had us fill out a bunch of forms, and one of them they asked if you had special talents and stuff like that, or things, and I put a couple of things down. One was I played slide trombone in high school days. And then I also put down that I had been an Explorer Scout, Boy Scout Explorer Scout, and reached the rank of what's called Star. If you've heard of Eagle Scout, it's 2 below that. And so I just put that down and didn't think more about it. But then that same day I'm asked to be a runner, I'm told they're having an audition to form a company band. That was that evening at around 6 o'clock. And I was supposed to start on maybe at 5 o'clock for the be the runner. And so I go to the command post and I say, I have to be there. And I thought they'd say, "Well, come when you're done." Instead they said, "Since you're just a warm body, we'll get somebody else." So I didn't have to do the running. Now, KP is something that you get to do occasionally, where you're getting up like 4 a.m., you're preparing meals, you're cleaning, you're up until 3 meals until sometime in the evening. And so it's not terribly fun. It's a lot of work. So I got up at the 4 and got there, we're doing, and then our unit was going to be hiking up this hill called Heartbreak Hill. I mean, like, kind of thing. And they were going to zero in their rifles, the sighting on the rifles. So about mid-morning, before we cleaned up for the morning meal, but we haven't done anything else, they have somebody comes in and says, you guys are going to the rifle range to zero in your rifles. And they brought another company of guys in to take over our KP. We go out to the rifle range, and like everything in the Army is, it's called wait. And so it took hours. Got back there finally, and it was in time for basically having dinner and cleaning up. Next time I have KP, another guy in my unit who was a draftee, he was a enlistee, he didn't want to do the mile run the next morning. So he said to me, I'll pay you $20 for letting me take your KP, because I don't want to run the mile, he said. So I said, sure. So next morning, they said, anybody need to go on sick call, step out. So I didn't run the mile, I didn't do KP. Next time was when we were doing final testing. Because you get out of basic training, you got to do final testing and pass. And so, again, end of the breakfast, we're cleaning up. They bring another unit in to take over for us because we cannot miss that testing. So these are the pieces that kept happening. And another one was, I got called to the company commander's office, a colonel. And inside I'm going, oh shoot, I'm in big trouble. Get in there, they say, we understand you're a Boy Scout, Explorer Scout, and we're having a jamboree, Boy Scout jamboree this weekend, and we want you to go to assist. Okay, go get your stuff and go there. Now, on Saturday, that Saturday morning, my unit in full packs was hiking up Heartbreak Ridge again. I was at the jamboree. At night, the colonel was at the fire. You know, we had a fire going. I was shooting the breeze with the colonel. My job there was on archery contest, and so I was kind of counting the points for the scouts who were doing it. I even got my picture in the paper. So final testing. I had missed a ton of training because I got on sick call 2 or 3 times a week. And so the Army has 3 days before you take all the final tests for review. It's on marching, it's on how to handle a gun, it's first aid, it's all kinds of stuff like that. I made sure to go each and every one of those sessions. So we were told the top 5 people in our platoon who scored the highest on the final testing would go and get a weekend pass. I came in number 2. Also, the first time I ever ran the mile in my life was on the final testing. And I finally did pass that also. So I graduate from basic, and now I'm on to advanced training, which is to learn how to be a clerk typist. We're in a dormitory now. There are bunk beds. There are 8 of us in the room. And so you go to class in the morning and you're practicing, and they told us you had to type 40 words a minute to graduate to the typist school. So after a few days, I knew I could type 40 words, even though I'm not a great typer, but a typist. So I passed the test. So they said, well, you could stay in the dorm. Well, in the dorm, over the course of the day, they'd be looking for guys to do different things. So what I found is I could hide under one of the bunk beds, way in a corner, and I'd sleep and I'd read. So they'd come looking for somebody, nobody in this room, and they go out. I got sent to on-the-job training where you had to type every single day, all day long. But after 2, and I didn't like doing that, it was after 2 days of that or 3 days of that, orders came down that we had to finish every module in the clerk typist school in order to graduate. I had skipped over a bunch of modules, so they put me back in the school. So I got out of typing all day long, and I made sure not to finish until it was okay. So we were going to go home for Christmas break and then come back for a week or something like a week before we get finished with basic. They told us, don't come back. So I wound up starting law school right when I was supposed to start law school. A couple more stories and I'll be done. My unit in Chicago's Civil Affairs Group, military government, we were assigned Norway. So if we ever had to conquer Norway, it would be our job to run the government and the country. You know, like, we're going to really attack Norway. Anyway, so we, for summer camp that summer, we're going to do a research project on Norway, and they sent us to one of 3 depositories of Norwegian books in this country, the University of Minnesota, Minneapolis. We stayed in the dormitory. We'd walk in to the library in the morning to quote-unquote do the research. Myself and a couple of guys would sneak out the side door. We'd hitchhike to one of the lakes, because it's full of lakes, and we would sunbathe and canoe and just play, and then hitchhike back and go back in and sign out and come out the front door. My job was researching the government of Norway. The day before this was due, I pulled out Encyclopedia Britannica, copied it word for word on the government structure in Norway. Our unit was complimented on the quality of our report. So what you're hearing is vignettes and pieces of where I was attempting to screw the Army and view it as I succeeded, but also all this other stuff happened that I didn't plan. The KPs, the going to the Jamboree, all that stuff kept happening to me. And it started to say to me, wait a minute, what's going on here? And that began the opening for my spiritual journey, because it was happening so much over such a short period of time, it started my awakening. So yeah, even though I got out of stuff and didn't do stuff, it's like God said, we'll play the game any way you want to play the game. And we'll support you in what you want to have happen, but there's going to be another piece, another growth that's going to come out of that. And it's from that that really began for me the notion of, there is a spirituality, and it's in me, and it's in you. Thank you.